So welcome. My name is Jim Keenan. I'm a Jesuit who teaches here at Boston College, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this seminar on Amoris Laetitia. This is a seminar that I'm going to tell you something about how it developed. Then I'm going to tell you something about basic rules. I'm an ethicist, so we like rules. And the last is to say something about the scope, if you will, of the conference. And then after myself, Cardinal Blaise Cupich will say a few things about the emerging agenda of this conference. First, a word about where we are. This is the former residence of the Archbishop of Boston, the Cardinal's residence, it was known as. And when the Archdiocese worked with Boston College in order to, Boston College was interested in helping the diocese, but also in getting some property in Brookline. So if you go across that street there, you're in Newton, but if you're on this side, you're in Boston. This was a very attractive proposal, and it's something that forged a very strong relationship between the president of the university, William P. Leahy, and Cardinal Archbishop Sean O'Malley, which goes to this day in a wonderful way. Beyond these doorways is the museum, the McMullen Museum, which you're free to visit. We figured that the conference center here provides us ample space. We'll be having lunch in the two rooms here, but there are breakout rooms. If you want to talk to anybody, this whole floor is ours for the next 2 days. So enjoy whatever time and space that you want to do here. You have a long lunch for about 2 hours. You can walk around here, you can meet with one another. The rest of the Boston College campus is right adjacent where you see the Church of St. Ignatius, and from there on in. Those of you who are at the liturgy this morning, that's in the Jesuit community, St. Mary's Hall. There are about 125 Jesuits on this campus, so we're the largest Jesuit presence in the United States. And this is in part because we have on this campus the School of Theology and Ministry, not to be confused with in the Amoris School of Arts and Sciences, where the Department of Theology is, where I teach, for instance, and Ken and Brian and others and Kathy teach as well here at Boston College. We have 65 theologians at this university, so you can think about that. Whether that's good or bad is another question. So that gives you an idea of where we are and that you'd be welcomed here. The liturgy you are at is an 8 a.m. Regularly scheduled liturgy. We have 50 Eucharistic liturgies on campus a week. We have the 8 a.m., the 11 a.m., and the noon every day of the week. And it's many, many members of the Boston College community, which is about 14,000 people, participate in those liturgies. You'll see tomorrow the same type. And tomorrow, Archbishop Wilton Gregory will be the celebrant. So that's just some background. Getting here. We got here because I wrote an article in Theological Studies on how Amoris Laetitia was being received elsewhere. And it was being received with a great deal of fervor, if you will, whether it was in Austria or in Germany, whether it was in Malta, whether it was in Argentina or South Africa or France, a variety of different places. It was being received, and I decided to write a reflection about the ongoing reception of it in the local churches of the Catholic Church. But I based my article on a work that Connor Kelly had done in the previous issue of Theological Studies about how we should read Amoris Laetitia. I sent the galleys to Cardinal Cupich, and he called me and he said, "I want to do a seminar. I want to do a seminar. Where should I do it?" I said, "Boston College would be fine to do it." And what I was thinking of was that Philippe Bourdain here, who is from the Institut Catholique. He's the president rector of the Institut Catholique. He, with Cardinal Vantois in Paris, hosted a seminar there. And it was a seminar by a university with the Cardinal Archbishop. And so I said, we have a paradigm to work with once we're here today. Then it was to find what did we want to do. We wanted to have a small conversation, a conversation that could happen by limiting the number of people. So we figured a space that could only take 50 people so that we would be restricted by actual limits. There are others who are going to be joining us. Archbishop Wester is on a red eye, and he's on his way here. Antonio Spadaro arrives later on this evening. We just got news that Bishop Overbeck from Essen is on his way, but it's late, but he'll be joining us for the dinner this evening. There's Archbishop Thompson coming as well, and there's one or two others who will join us. But we'll be a comfortable group of 50 in this room. As we were trying to work out the program, we decided we wanted to invite people because of their competencies. We wanted Philippe Bourdain to be here because we wanted to know what they had done in Paris. But we also were looking for people who could contribute in a particular way. We thought of Jack Alessandro because of his work in canon law, and Kathy Caveney for her work in law itself. We thought of Katerina Schuth for all her work on priestly formation. We thought of Lisa Cahill and Julie Hanlon-Rubio for their work on marriage, and Connor Kelly for his work on family. We thought of Rick Gallardi, who's joining us on ecclesiology, Brian Robinette and Megan Clark for their work on the younger people, the nuns, what do we call them? Nuns. The nuns, the people who are looking for a spirituality perhaps with or without a church. But then we thought we have to have this as not just theologians, but more importantly, theologians who are serving the bishops. And so we decided, who should we invite among the bishops? And right away, we decided we wanted to invite Archbishop Scicluna from Malta for all his work that he had been doing on the synod. We invited Cardinal Marx, who was unable to come, and he suggested that Bishop Overbeck, who was at the two synods and was one of the draftsmen of the German bishop's statement, that he would join us, and he is joining us. We thought of Bishop McElroy, that he could be able to guide us, especially for all his work that he did in San Diego on synods. And so we began to continue to say, everybody in this room, all 40 of the participants, whether they're theologians or social scientists or members of the episcopacy, we're here for a conversation. We're here for a conversation. And it's a conversation, though, with a particular agenda. And the agenda is to be focused on Amoris Laetitia, and that's it. So some rules to share with you. You know my 15-minute rule. I host conferences of 600, 400. I've done international conferences. Among ethicists, I'm known for insisting on the 15-minute, and I think you got my message. Otherwise, shaming, as an ethicist, shame and guilt is good, but shame is better, and we can go in that direction. But we will do this because we want to have a conversation, and it can only happen by these limits. The media, there are 11 members of the media here with us. All the presentations are being videotaped. You all signed waivers, so they're already in the public forum, and therefore the media has free rein on this material. We ask that in the second sessions, which are not videotaped, the discussions, that if the media in any way want to make an attribution of what was said by a particular person, that you simply ask the person if you can make that attribution. Otherwise, you can just say someone said it. But we ask that on the matter of attribution, if it's not in a presentation but during the discussion, that you simply ask out of courtesy the person who spoke. I think that that's the basic rules of the House, 15 minutes and our engagement and what that means. Finally, to say something about this conference. this is a conference on Amoris Laetitia. We're interested in recognizing that in the universal church there is momentum that has been occurring on moral formation and pastoral practice. So when we began to plan this, right away we decided that we needed to go to a group of foundations to ask them to help us to have this conversation. And you'll see in your program that we list at the bottom of the inside page there that the Archdiocese of Chicago, the Cushman Foundation, the Healy Family Foundation, and the Henry Luce Foundation all helped us in order to put this conference together. And this conference, we're looking for, I use the word reception, but we're going to be trying to turn away from the word reception. Last night we had a dinner, a couple of us together, Bishop McElroy, Archbishop Scicluna, Father Luke Camelli, Philippe Bourdain, Cardinal Supich, Cardinal Farrell, and we had a conversation about what were our expectations about moving this forward. And two watchwords came up. One was pastoral conversion. When we look at Amoris Laetitia, there's a language there. It's a language of conscience. It's a language of accompaniment. It's the language of discernment. These are words that emerge there. John Strinkowski, in an excellent piece in America, talked about a word that only appears once but really captures the disposition, and that's empathy. That pastoral conversion in Amoris Laetitia is about creating a new empathy for the family, for the Catholic family, for the way that the family around the world tries to deal with the enormous challenges that they have. So a new pastoral conversion among the clergy, among the episcopacy, among the theologians, among the entire members of the church, toward the conditions and the challenges that people have. And therefore, at this conference, we want to see how can we make this new momentum on Amoris Laetitia to reawaken an empathy toward the condition of married life. This is really the focus of this. But we don't simply want to go to conversion. We want to go to implementation. We want at this conference not to be simply a sharing of ideas, but also a sharing of strategies, a sharing of ways that we can talk concretely, how here we can experience pastoral conversion and take hold of what that means concretely in the lives of our dioceses, archdioceses, of our universities, of our different communities that we partake in. So I think that's really rather critical. There's one constituency that we do not have here, which is not an oversight, it's just a matter of accommodation. We decided we wanted to bring the episcopacy, but we also wanted to bring the theologians who would help serve. So the last session is about how can the theologians serve the episcopacy. But there's also those who are in pastoral formation. And many of us can name a variety of people who have really helped married couples prepare for marriage, that they've helped in archdioceses and dioceses, trying to deal with the challenges that married life is about. With those people, we have to figure out bringing into the conversation. So this is the initiation of a conversation here. We conclude tomorrow at 4 o'clock. But that's not the end of our conversation. It's the end of the first stage of it. So just these watchwords, pastoral conversion and implementation. That's what we're looking for here. Have a good conference. I'm at your service, so is Tony Ross, the Associate Director, who's waving from behind the door. And now it's Cardinal Supich.
Thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it. Welcome to all of you. And I want to, first of all, thank Boston College and Father Keenan and all of his staff for the heavy work that was done, the organizational piece that was important. The Pope says that realities are greater than ideas, and I can tell you, while I might have had the idea, the realities of getting this work were much greater, and so thank you for what you've done here. And thank all of you for taking time out. You're busy people, you have many obligations, and so your commitment to this project of being here is really very inspiring to all of us. I want to make 3 points as we begin here. I think it's important to go back to the first paragraphs of Amoris Laetitia. The Pope makes a very penetrating and insightful comment that should keep us focused as we move forward. He says that if we look at scriptures, we see that God has chosen to reveal the divine reality in the privileged place of family life. How true that is if you look at the opening chapters of Genesis all the way to the final scene in the book of Revelation. The context is always families, of people coming together as families. And I think that's important for us to really grab a hold of as we begin this. That what we're talking about is not just ways in which we can be of service to people, service to families, but also for us who are involved in the pastoral work of the church to keep in mind that that's where we find God revealing the divine reality. That it is the privileged place that God has chosen in order for us to come to know who God is. And so I think that is a key element for us to begin. That it's not so much that we're treating families as kind of a laboratory in which we do pastoral practice or theology, but rather it's the privileged place that we are graced to be a part of in the work that we do as pastors, as theologians, to see where God is active, where God is alive and God is doing something new. That should focus our attention. The second point I want to make is that we want to make sure, too, that we look at the full breadth of family life, not just in terms of the moral questions. Chapter 8 is something that people really go to right away, and you have the commentary there of Cardinal Coco Pomerio. But I would caution us that there are other dimensions of family life that the Pope treats in Amoris Laetitia that have to do not just with the moral questions, but also the social life, the economic constraints, and the difficulties that people face in raising families and raising children. So we want to make sure that we keep in mind that as pastors and theologians, we're in touch with that reality as well in terms of where God is revealing, where God is working in the world. What are some of the questions there that need to be looked at? And finally, I think it's important to pick up on something that Father Jim said about the need for not just going to the point of receiving this document, but really appropriating it. Appropriating it in a way that calls us to a conversion, or as Father Monsignor Strnkowski used that word, empathy, in which our hearts are going to be moved in a different way. We're going to see that this pastoral emphasis that the Holy Father gives to theology as well as practice is something that should change us and make a difference. And it's in that light that I want to conclude with a little story. It's a personal vignette from my own life, taught to me by my grandmother. All four of my grandparents were immigrants from Croatia. They always spoke with broken English, had no more than a 6th grade education. My mother's parents raised 4 children, and the last child in the family, Roseanne, was born with severe mental and emotional handicaps. And as she got older and they got older, it was very clear to my grandparents that they were not able to keep her at home because she would become irascible and even violent. She was overweight, and they knew they couldn't care for her in a way that would keep her and them safe. And so on the very meager income of my grandfather, who worked in the packing houses in South Omaha, they decided to have her situated in a home not too far from Omaha. But as a courtesy, they went to talk to the pastor about it. He had been there for a long time, in fact, ended up being there for 46 years. Grandma would go and cook on occasion and clean house. She knew Monsignor very well. He was of the same heritage. And they wanted, as a courtesy, to tell him their struggle and with the decision they had come to. And so they sat there in front of Monsignor and told of their situation, and he stopped them and he says, "You can't do this. You cannot abandon your child like this. This is terrible that you would do something like this." So they left crestfallen, walking home in silence. Finally, my grandfather broke the silence And he says, well, Ma, what are we going to do? She said, well, tomorrow we're going to pack up the car and we're going to go take Roseanne to the home. And my grandfather said, yeah, but what about what Monsignor said? And my grandmother said, Monsignor doesn't have to live with Roseanne. My grandmother told me that story the week after I was ordained a priest. And I believe she did it to tell me that I should look for a different way to work with people and treat them and have the kind of empathy that Monsignor Strinkowski talked about, to have a conversion of heart, to really be in touch with the ordinary life situation that people have to struggle with each and every day as they make some very difficult decisions. So that we really not only encounter people, we accompany them, and we have to also integrate them in the life of the church with their struggles that they have. So as we take up this work today, let's keep in mind what the Holy Father tells us at the beginning chapters, that we're privileged to be a part of that privileged place of family life, to see where God is working. And that we also need to keep in mind that it's more than the moral questions. It's the social issues, the economic issues that people face. But also be willing to have an appropriation that brings a change of heart. To remember all the people out there who look at us and say, you know, you don't have to live with Roseanne. Thank you.
So we're ready to move to the first panel presentation. If I could ask Natalia, Vanessa, Kathy, and, yeah, right up here. And Ken, it's all yours. We've provided each of you a copy of Coco Palmieri's commentary on the 8th chapter. All right?
Yes. Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is not a Boston accent you're listening to. This is Brooklynese, the way God wanted English to be spoken. Right? Our first presentation will be from 4 well-informed discussants, and this is really a sort of table-setting agenda. It's to put things in context in terms of how do these people see Amoris Laetitia affecting and being heard and appropriated and received within communities with which they're familiar. So we're going to have 15-minute presentations, as Jim mentioned. We're just going to follow the order that's there in front of you on your programs. And so to begin this and get out of the way, Natalia Imperatori Lee from Manhattan College. Natalia.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Cardinal Supich, and to Boston College, everyone here. I am so humbled at the opportunity to be here with you today. I'm looking forward to lively discussion, and I'm going to get started because we only have 15 minutes. Today, I want to present some categories within which the reception of Amoris Laetitia in the Latino community should be understood. But beyond that, I want to point to ways in which Hispanic Catholics, their lives, their theologies, stand at the leading edge of a church of encounter and accompaniment, ushering us away from a church of command and obligation. My view of this reception and this contribution necessarily takes a hemispheric perspective, not only because of the technological advances that have shrunk our hemisphere, or because of the demographic reality of an increasingly Latino church in this country, but because popes since John Paul II have encouraged us to embrace a self-understanding that there is but one ecclesia in America. So I will draw on insights not only from Hispanic theologians in the United States, but theologians in Mexico and Peru, from Pope Francis's comments in Colombia, from the guidelines of the Argentine bishops. All of these are part of the reception of Amoris Laetitia. In addition to the macrocosm of this hemispheric church, my understanding of the reception of Amoris is informed by the microcosm of my own social location as a married mother of 2 sons, a laywoman theologian, a Cuban American. I must confess, the majority of my sense of what's going on in Amoris Laetitia comes from my own experience of co-raising 2 children. and particularly of the futility and folly of supposing that a family is anything like a closed system, where parents set out expectations that are flawlessly followed by children. Family life has been for me an experience marked by metanoia, a constant catechesis, inviting me to rethink what I presumed were inflexible principles like maternal instinct and family expectation, and applying them to the living, evolving relationships in which I'm entwined on a daily basis. It's my hunch that Pope Francis is inviting the whole church into that dynamic that I learn in my own corner of the domestic church. There are then three key words to understand the reception of Amoris in Latino communities: colonialism, conscience, and accompaniment. So first, colonialism. The reception of Amoris cannot be understood apart from the historical context of colonialism in Latin America and in Latino communities here in the United States. The legacy of colonialism is one marked by violence, physical, cultural, and spiritual violence. This legacy means that in the Latino community, certain dangerous tendencies are intensified in the interaction of families and lay people generally with the church. Ecclesially, this is manifest in two complementary realities: the infantilization of the laity and clericalism. Reading Amoris from the perspective of the Hispanic Church, we see Pope Francis pointing to the infantilization of lay people and families that is so commonly a feature of colonization. And here I'm thinking especially of paragraph 37. We find it difficult to present marriage more as a dynamic path than a lifelong burden. We find it hard to make room for the consciences of the faithful. We're called to form consciences and not replace them. The infantilization of the laity has its historical roots in a view of lay people as objects of clerical control, as you know: pay, pray, and obey, or as Pius X noted in Vehemente Nos, my very favorite of these, quote, "The right of the laity is to allow itself to be led." If this was true of the laity broadly understood, you can laugh, it's okay. If this was true of the laity broadly understood, it was intensified in the case of colonized territories like Latin America. Historically, Hispanic cultures were viewed as indolent, incapable of learning, especially indigenous and Black cultures. This accounts for the dearth of indigenous clergy all over Latin America for so long. The repercussions of the dominant culture's reluctance to ordain indigenous clergy can still be seen in the relatively small number of Hispanic bishops in a church that is increasingly Spanish-speaking here in the United States. 38% of U.S. Catholics identify as Latino, and 3% of priests do. Within this colonial frame, married life can still be viewed vestigially as a haven for lust, particularly for populations of color where hypersexuality is assumed as a cultural feature. Conjugal life is overdetermined, an object of moral pronouncements and abstract ideals about the function of marriage as unitive or procreative or indissoluble. Failure to live up to these ideals, right, we're presenting the idea and expecting results, reinforces, when we fail at this, it reinforces the caricatures of indolence, violence, and hypersexuality. In the face of this, we see many marriages in the Hispanic communities that are irregular, as they're called, right? Couples circumventing the church because of lack of access to clergy, or lack of resources to pay for a church wedding, or the circumstances of migration that preclude the realities of marriage. Beyond this, lay people are infantilized by a logic, as pointed out by the Argentine bishops, where pastors serve as gatekeepers offering permission for sacraments rather than as counselors who accompany Catholics on their sacramental journeys. This is not unique to Hispanic communities, as I learned firsthand at my son's confirmation prep meeting last week, where the pastor of the predominantly Irish-American parochial school declared that he, and he alone, decides who gets confirmed in our neighborhood. It was very threatening. The children were impressed. This infantilization is not one-sided, though. Clericalism is the complement to the infantilizing impulse of the colonial view, and it's not a problem unique to the clergy. Francis's repeated admonitions against clericalism are a warning for the laity as much as for priests, maybe more. Non-clergy are tempted to clericalism to elevate the priest to superhuman status and thereby to infantilize themselves, to become children who are told what to do which is easier than doing the hard work of developing one's conscience and engaging in discernment. Infantilization and clericalism, therefore, can't be separated, nor are they sins that belong to only one sector or another of the church. As our Pope likes to say, we are all sinners here. Against the logic of colonialism, clericalism, and infantilization, we must assert the message of liberation theology that the poor and the marginalized are subjects of their own history. Analogously, then, the family after Amoris becomes the protagonist of its own destiny. In Amoris 200, we read that the Synod Fathers declared that Christian families are the principal agents of the family apostolate. Couples become the subjects of their history, even as pastors and confessors retain a role of accompaniment and listening in order to orient this intrafamilial ministry. The second category that I'd like to talk about today is conscience. When Amoris claims in paragraph 37 that we are called to form and not replace consciences, Peruvian theologian Gregorio Pérez de Guereñol, great name, notes that the replacement of conscience is an act of domination, again, of colonization. It's an abuse of power. The formation of conscience, on the other hand, is life-giving ministry because it loves an other into freedom. I want to say a word on freedom here. Many of the misgivings and nervousness about Amoris, expressed by some sectors of the church, seems to surround the move away from doctrine as something one asserts expecting obedience, toward doctrine as something derived from unchanging principles, but that nevertheless requires application to specific circumstances, not all of which are identical. The concern is frequently expressed in a worry that this will confuse the faithful. This is, again, an infantilizing impulse. And I fear it's a childish view of the freedom necessary for discernment of conscience. Let me give you a real-world example. My children constantly lament that they are not adults because, in their opinion, adults get to do whatever they want. My standard response, in varying tones depending on the amount of patience I have remaining, which is usually very small, is I never, ever get to do what I want. Isn't that right, Brian? In moving away from rigid magisterial presentations, some fear that relativism is going to creep in and the laity will just do whatever it wants. This is a child's view of freedom. Adult life, as we all know, particularly adult life enmeshed in relationships of care, seldom results in doing what I want. My desires are always already desires in relation. My decisions affect my spouse, my children, my mother, my colleagues, my students. Everyone has a claim on my desires. Hispanic theology invites us to think of human freedom a little bit differently because it presents an alternate view of the human person. Gary Ribi-Estrella noted that in Latino communities, rather than being a voluntary association of individuals focused on self-determination, these communities tend to view themselves anthropologically as socially constituted. There's a pre-existent we that characterizes me, and it factors into the reception of Amoris Laetitia, I think, in Hispanic communities. Ribi's description highlights a different approach to the human person that's shared by many outside of the Hispanic community, and it serves as an invitation to those who don't share it. Latino Catholics have long embraced Jim Keenan's suggestion that Amoris proposes relationality in the face of cold rationality. The work of Roberto Goizueta builds on this anthropological notion of we. He describes humanity in relation as necessary and pre-existent. Entering into relationship is not merely an option between two autonomous individuals. There's a sense in which we always belong to an other. We belong to other people, and this is what makes us human. We're responsible for others. Freedom, then, is not freedom from interference, but rather freedom in relation. This is where conscience operates, not as an individual act of the isolated will. The third and final category I hope to highlight today that helps characterize or contextualize, I guess, the reception of Amoris is accompaniment. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about that. No other word speaks to the goal of Francis's papacy, I think, and the point of Amoris like accompaniment. It is the praxis that lives alongside conscience, between ideal principles and their application to particular situations. And it is the special vocation of Christians to accompany one another. Accompaniment is a notion that's at the heart of Hispanic communities. In language, right? I accompany you in your grief. In our greetings and goodbyes, may God accompany you, which is how my mother always says goodbye. Deeply rooted in these cultures, it's not surprising that accompaniment features as well in Latino theology, and Goizueta's work is just one example. A model of ministry and really an entire ecclesiology based on accompaniment is what I believe Francis is aiming for in Amoris. This marks, crucially, a move away from what Cardinal Schönborn has called an ethics of obligation that generates both laxity and rigorism. The ethics of obligation is an ecclesiological hallmark, I think, of North American Catholicism, especially in the Northeast, influenced by Northern European cultures. Latino theologians like Goizueta suggest accompaniment as an alternative model rooted in the popular Catholic practices of a variety of Hispanic cultures. The act of traveling with an other is seen in devotions like Christmas Posadas or Marian devotion to the Sorrowful Mother or to Our Lady of la Soledad. For Goizueta, thank you, accompaniment guards against romanticization because we can only romanticize that which we do not truly know. What does this accompaniment look like in Amoris? Well, the walking with families and couples traversing diverse realities and true challenges serves as a catechesis for all companions on the journey. Just as popular Catholic practices in Hispanic communities foreground the sacred in the everyday, accompaniment in ministry may reveal the possibility that the daily life of couples and families has something to offer the doctrinal pronouncements on marriage. If nothing else, accompaniment works against the romanticization of marriage and family that pervades our church's teaching on these topics, and even creeps into Amoris Laetitia's discussion of mothering and fathering in Chapter 5. Accompaniment implies equality, a walk alongside, needs empathy, etc., etc. This is for Goizueta a central concern, right? It's not only about walking together, but walking in a direction. And it doesn't need to be the theologian or the pastor that sets the direction. The magnetic north is the encounter with Christ. Therefore, everyone on the journey is capable and called to navigate, and there will be times, as there have been, when couples lead the way to the encounter with Christ. I'm skipping ahead. In truth, there's no way to speak for the 30.4 millions of Hispanic Catholics in the U.S. or their reception of Amoris Laetitia. To do that, I invite you to speak to our colleague, Josman Ospino, who's standing right there. As a systematic theologian, I can point to specific problems that I'm sure resonate with my communities, right? The pervasive reality of domestic violence, the horror of drug addiction and alcohol abuse, the impact of unjust migration laws and abject poverty on couples and children. I can highlight ways in which the message of Amoris is intensified by the colonial history of Latin America and of the U.S., the violence of clericalism and the infantilization of the laity. But I would much rather the takeaway be, instead of the ways in which the Latino community is reacting to the document, are the varied ways in which Hispanics in their daily lives and practice, and in their theological and anthropological insights, invite all Christians to embody the message of Amoris in the Church Universal. The centrality of conscience and freedom in relation. The notion of relationality is a pre-existent condition of humanity and not an act of the will. And the vision of accompaniment as a model for ministry in all aspects of the church are what I hope will be the contributions of the reception of Amoris in this country and in the whole church. Thank you very much.
Continuing our conversation, we're now going to hear from C. Vanessa White of the Catholic Theological Union.
Thank you. Okay, I have a handout for you. I decided it's always good to have some takeaway. Let me take one. I have them. Yeah, everything's the same. Yeah, let's pass it. Get this. Set this down. Okay, good. I'd like to begin by thanking Cardinal Supich and Jim Keenan and all of you here present for being here, and also specifically for the invitation to speak on Amoris Laetitia from the perspective of the Black Catholic community. Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love, acknowledges the challenges facing families today, as well as addressing the pastoral implications for ministers who journey with families. I am grateful for the opportunity to share with you this reflection on how Amoris Laetitia has been received within the Black Catholic community. As a practical Catholic woman theologian whose focus is spirituality and ministry, I wish to begin by framing my remarks with the words and experiences of a diverse community of Black Catholic scholars and theologians. I acknowledge the contributions of first-generation Black Catholic theologians M. Sean Copeland, Diana Hayes, Jamie T. Phelps, as well as the work of Black Catholic historian Father Cyprian Davis, whose book, The History of Black Catholics in the United States, has given voice to Black Catholics whose contributions and history had remained invisible within the institutional church. Furthermore, moral theologian and activist Father Brian Massingale's groundbreaking work, Racial Justice and the Catholic Church, is must-reading for anyone ministering here in the United States. The writings of Copeland, Hayes, Phelps, Davis, and Massingale are an invaluable resource for gaining a greater understanding of the context of Black Catholic life, faith, and spirituality. The late Father Cyprian Davis has stated that the story of African American Catholicism is the story of a people who obstinately clung to a faith that gave them sustenance, even when it did not always make them feel welcome. I share with you a reflection from a Black Catholic graduate alum at Catholic Theological Union. Her reflection, entitled, Like a Motherless Child, addresses the reality of Black Catholics who many times had to push their way in, who felt like motherless children. Mother Church, I am here. Mother Church, I am ready. Mother Church, I am willing. Mother Church, I have been knocking for years. You have locked me out for years. I will not go away. I will not disappear. You have to open your doors. I will not stop knocking. Mother Church, I will knock till there is a hole in your door. I will come through the hole. I will bring my open heart and my open mind. I will bring my mother, my God. Yes, Mother Church, I am here. I am knocking. I am willing. I am ready. I will no longer feel like a motherless child. Black Catholics have had to fight for their faith, and this fight was not only with other Catholics who questioned their legitimacy as Catholics, but also often with members of their own household who could not understand why they embraced a faith that did not always recognize their gifts. As this handout I've given you states, Black Catholic families challenge one another and challenge the church to be truly Christian and Catholic. Sister Thea Bowman states that within African American households can be found large families, small families, nuclear families, extended families, single-parent families, adopted and foster families, rich families, poor families, matriarchal and patriarchal families, gospel-loving, shouting, testifying, fussing, and fighting families. There is not one typical description that can be ascribed to African American families. In 2011, sociologists Darren Davis and Don Pope Davis hope to shed a light on the faith of African Americans in the first ever National Black Catholic Survey sponsored by the National Black Catholic Congress and the Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. This survey sought to measure the religious engagement of African Americans. Davis and Pope Davis concluded from their study that African American Catholics tended to be highly engaged, particularly if members of a predominantly Black parish. Membership in a Black parish reflects shared social and cultural experiences that connect people through a common reality and identity. The importance of social connections of African American Catholics and the influence on religious engagement cannot be overstated. This would tend to reinforce what our black bishops initially stated in 1984 in their pastoral letter on evangelization in the black Catholic community entitled, "What We Have Seen and Heard." And one of the authors of that pastoral is here with us, Bishop Wilton Gregory. In this letter, the bishops recognize 4 characteristics of black spirituality and religiosity. Black spirituality is contemplative, holistic, communitarian, and joyful. Furthermore, for black Catholics, God was felt deep down in their souls. And as Sister Thea Bowman has stated, their spirituality is the soul of the people. To minister to black Catholic families, one must understand the roots of their spirituality and how their spirituality has shaped their family life and their culture. This is what has been the focus for African American Catholic marriage and family life ministers Andrew and Terry Like. For the past 35 years, the Likes have focused on marriage and family within the black community with their Arusi Network ministries and addressed the importance of attending to the spirituality and culture of African Americans in responding to the needs of families. In their new book, Marriage on a Lampstand, Exploring a New Paradigm for Modern Christian Marriage, they have sadly concluded that the institution of marriage has virtually collapsed among African Americans. As the Likes have shared, we marry least compared to all other measured ethnic groups, and when we marry, we divorce at the highest rate. What has been the Catholic Church's response? According to the Likes, predominantly African American parishes are the least likely to have a viable outreach to marriage. The handout addresses some of the challenges within the community. It is a virtual litany of challenges. In light of these challenges, what new approaches to catechizing, encouraging, supporting, and celebrating marriage and families has been implemented? Also, as Terry and Andrew Like challenged, are we reaching out to those who are ambivalent about marriage, yet are forming families? Andrew Like states that Amoris Laetitia invites and empowers an expansive approach to the Church's accompaniment of families regarding the sacrament of marriage. In their book, they focus on the document's approach to accompaniment of families. For the Likes, a major theme of Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, is accompaniment. And this connects very clearly with what the bishops have said about the African American family being a communitarian family. I am because we are. There must be that journey. There must be that walking with families. They state that there is a symbiotic relationship between marriage and community, and the ministry of accompaniment that leads couples, regardless of their marital status, to participate in the sacramental life of the church throughout the public witness of marriage. While Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, seeks to address the reality and challenges of family life today, unfortunately, this document has not truly had an impact in the life of Black Catholic community. When I was asked to give this presentation, I informally solicited feedback from colleagues in the Black Catholic community, members of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium, Black Catholic graduate students at Catholic Theological Union, and ministers in the Black Catholic community in the Archdiocese of Chicago. Sad to say, most of these who responded said there's been little impact. One response was striking and came from a Black Catholic DRE who ministers to families in the parish in the Archdiocese. In response to your, I quote, "In response to your question regarding how has Amoris Laetitia been received, I offer the following observations," she states. When Amoris Laetitia first came out, it was discussed briefly and we included information and flyers, but there wasn't an overall interest from the parish to read the document in its entirety. Some of our families are in survival mode, struggling with under and unemployment, divorce, and single parenthood. Families are simply trying to ensure that their children are not victims of the violence that plagues our city. We have families that come to church occasionally because of the struggles they are facing. If it is a question of work, school, or church, some of our families choose the former rather than the latter. She further responds, while the Pope's words are encouraging and provide guidelines for ministers to serve God's people, our families are looking for more tangible solutions that plague them. I would say that rather than just talking about the joy of love as a document, we who have read it are attempting to use it as a guide to provide the support that our families need. This is in the form of journeying with parents and children when they are faced with struggles, providing them with resources that can help them, and letting them know that the church and Eucharist is always there to nourish their bodies and souls without restrictions. I guess by letting our families know that they are not alone in the struggle and that God has not forsaken them, that is the best way we can implement the joy of love, end quote. This document must be in dialogue with the life and context of the people. Church leadership must learn and continue to make strides to understand the context of Black people. I am reminded of the story of Jesus and the woman of the well. Jesus knew her context. He responded and affirmed her gifts. He took the time to be present to her, and she was transformed. We must address the current realities of the Black community, which has been challenged historically and in the present day by racism, which has institutionally taken forms of increased unemployment and underemployment, inadequate health care, incarceration, increased violence in our communities, etc., etc. All which then impact families. As Jesus knew the context of those who he ministered to, we must do the same if we wish to have a spiritual and pastoral impact in the Black community. Our families are suffering because we have not addressed their pain, their reality, their struggles. The selected bibliography I share with you today is a step in that direction as we continue to journey together in the days ahead to minister to families from our diverse communities and to truly live out the hopes and goals of Amoris Laetitia. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. We'll continue the conversation now with Lou Camelli from the Archdiocese of Chicago.
I'm really grateful to be here. Already, I think my two panelists, Vanessa, fellow Chicagoan, and Natalia, already we begin to get a sense of the grace that's at work in this gathering. What a wonderful opportunity. So I'm just very happy to be here. So the topic that it's stated in your program is understanding and misunderstanding the scope, the challenge, and the promise of Amoris Laetitia. How is it being received? But even before responding to the question of how Amoris Laetitia is being received in the United States context with all, as we've already heard, its cultural diversity and religious diversity, we have to, I think, consider two prior questions. Is it being read? Is it being read? And how is it being read? I can't provide hard statistics, but I've done my own little investigation in conversation with priests and ecclesial lay ministers and laity in general. And I conclude that nearly all of them have not read Amoris Laetitia, or if they have, it's been in a very cursory way. In general, people know Amoris Laetitia through secondary sources which focus almost exclusively on Chapter 8, accompanying, discerning, and integrating weakness. And within that chapter, questions surrounding divorced and remarried Catholics and admission to the Eucharist. And of course, that's an important question and a concern of great importance for some people, and it ought to be for the Church at large. But Amoris Laetitia has a much, much larger scope, challenge, and promise than that. At the beginning of Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis acknowledges the difficulty of reading the text, just reading the text. He writes in number 7, "Given the rich fruits of the 2-year synod process, this exhortation will treat in different ways a wide variety of questions. This explains its inevitable length. Consequently, I do not recommend a rushed reading of the text." I think he recommends a reading, but not necessarily a rushed reading of the text. But in addition to the challenging length of the document, its patterns of organization and development can also prove to be challenging. So Cardinal Francesco Cocco Palmerio, in his commentary on Chapter 8, reordered the themes to make more evident what he calls, quote, "the logic of the arguments," unquote. Whether because of its length or internal organization, Amoris Laetitia is not easy to read. As I noted, most people have not read it, but instead have relied on secondary reporting with its often uneven presentation. And for those who do read it, it becomes, in effect, something of an ecclesiastical Rorschach test. People project their own particular concerns or perspectives on the text, whether those have to do with doctrine, morality, juridical questions, or general pastoral practice. And all of this is understandable. It's quite understandable, but it's also unfortunate, because Amoris Laetitia breaks new and important ground for the life of the Church and the future of faith. Now, certainly elements of doctrine, morality, law, and general pastoral practice are present in Amoris Laetitia, especially as presuppositions. But the whole of it, what Italians would call the insieme, the whole of it together, is nothing short of a new momentum for spiritual, moral formation and pastoral practice, as the title of our conference indicates. In a word, Amoris Laetitia is a formation document, and that is what makes it both remarkable and novel in the history of magisterial teaching. This novelty, as I hope to illustrate, has its roots in the Second Vatican Council, with the Council's concern for human experience and for the journey of the pilgrim people of God. Amoris Laetitia takes those concerns and situates marriage and family life as a central focus for conversion and transformation in the Christian life. In a sense, this movement is a logical consequence of the spiritual revolution begun by Saint Therese of Lisieux and her foundation for a democratization of holiness. That is, an immediate and full access for all people in the ordinary circumstances of their lives. Perhaps on first hearing, these affirmations do not seem to be exceptional in any particular way. In fact, unlike any other magisterial document that I know of, as a document of formation, it sets a context to move from human experience to the spiritual transformation of that experience and those who hold it. In other words, Amoris Laetitia engages those who are married and in family life in a way that can foster growth in their lives as disciples of Jesus, empowered by the Spirit, ultimately leading them to the perfection or full actuation of their love. As I read Amoris Laetitia with a formational lens, I detect 4 drivers in its composition and development. And these drivers move from experience to experience transformed. The first driver is for married people and families to claim their experience with all its lights and shadows. The second is to see the experience in the light of the gospel. The third is to hear a call to conversion. And finally, the fourth is to carry that transformed experience to a world deeply in need. When I read Amoris Laetitia with these 4 drivers in mind, what initially seemed to me to be a long and lumbering text achieved a deep coherence and a compelling argument. The roots for Amoris Laetitia as a document of formation rest in the Second Vatican Council, more specifically in at least 3 important proposals of the Council: the universal call to holiness, the importance of dialogue in an ecclesia discens et docens, and the journey or process dimension of the Christian life for individuals and indeed for the whole community as the pilgrim people of God. So let me repeat again, we are not accustomed to a magisterial document that is formational, especially in the context of marriage and family life. If you consult, for example, Edward Schillebeck's classic book, 2-volume study, Marriage, Human Reality and Saving Mystery, you can understand that for most of the first 2 millennia, the theological and magisterial developments around marriage and family life had mainly to do with juridical questions and questions surrounding the sacramentality of marriage. Only in the last 2 centuries, with the crisis of family life triggered by the Industrial Revolution and then by the availability of artificial contraception, do the teachings on marriage shift, but then mainly to resolve questions of rights and morality. And even Pope John Paul II's Apostolic Exhortation, Familiaris Consortio 1981, is fundamentally a reprise of questions around doctrine, rights, morality, social analysis, and general pastoral care. Amoris Laetitia, on the other hand, assumes doctrine, moral teaching, law, and basic pastoral care concerning marriage and family life. There are no changes, despite claims to the contrary, for example, in the Sic Dicta Dubia. Amoris Laetitia does offer spiritual and moral formation in helping and preparing people to live out their commitment as disciples of Jesus Christ and to grow in it in the particular context of marriage and family life. So it assumes that the Christian life unfolds in a process that has real ideals which remain even when we vary in reaching them. We had a little paper mix-up here. Here we go. So those ideals are real and operative even when we don't fully attain them, and that neither programs nor pronouncements, but God's grace leads us forward, although we, with God's help, can create those favorable conditions for accepting that grace. As a magisterial document that serves the spiritual and moral formation of the people of God, Amoris Laetitia is unique. Were we to search for parallels, 2 strong examples from our spiritual tradition come to my mind: the Rule of St. Benedict and the Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Both of these precious resources from our tradition situate disciples of Jesus in a particular environment, whether of community life or a meditative, contemplative experience of the Gospels, with the goal of opening believers to transformation, either as a conversatio morum, a full conversion of life, or a new freedom to act from love and to find God in all things. Formation in this context never means stamping out Christians in cookie-cutter fashion. It means attention to the concrete and particular, the unique and unrepeatable story of this individual, this marriage, and this family. Finally, let me say that the famous chapter 8 that deals with irregular situations does not look the same when you look at it from a formational perspective. It does not deviate from doctrinal or moral teaching. And as Father Basilio Petra, president of the Italian Association of Moral Theologians, has unequivocally demonstrated in his commentary, Amoris Laetitia, accompagnare, discernere e integrare la fragilità, the practical directives in chapter 8 echo the classical praxis confessorum, confessional practice that one might find already rooted in St. Alphonsus Maria de Liguori. In the end, Amoris Laetitia is waiting to be read and then received as a remarkable path of spiritual and moral formation for ordinary people living extraordinary lives in marriage and family. And that, in my estimation, sums up the scope, the challenge, and the promise of Amoris Laetitia. And so, in the words of Augustine, words that he heard in the garden, the moment that he sought God's grace and God's grace sought him, we can begin by saying to each other and to those we serve, Tolle lege. Tolle lege. Pick it up and read.
Thank you, Lou. Our final presenter will be, for the first panel, will be Kathy Caveney from Boston College.
Okay, thanks. Get organized here. Well, I too would like to extend my great appreciation to Cardinal Supich for organizing, for giving the energy to this wonderful event, and especially as a member of the Boston College faculty, to thank Jim Keenan and Tony Ross for effectuating it here. There's a phrase that's often said, familiarity breeds contempt. That is totally wrong, absolutely wrong in this case. Familiarity breeds awe. Anybody who hangs around Jim Keenan and Tony is just utterly amazed at what they're able to accomplish on a day-to-day basis. So our task is to, in this panel, is to bring our own experience, our own background, our own cultures to the question of Amoris Laetitia. My background is not in terms of culture that I'm bringing, but training. I'm bringing my background as a lawyer as well as a moral theologian to address some of the questions that have arisen in connection with the document. And while the whole conference has been insisted is not about Chapter 8, my own particular contribution, set in the broader context of this conference, will be focused on some of the issues that are raised and the controversies that are raised on Chapter 8. But my challenge today for all of you is to ask you to extend your imaginations toward the field of law. Those two concepts, imagination and law, don't normally go together, but I'm going to try my best to get you to see how law does not have to function as a deadening, as a legalistic, to use a word, as a constricting and merciless body of learning and insight, but can in fact contribute to notions of accompaniment, of relationship, it doesn't have to be cold rationality, and pastoral concern. And so I'd like to begin with Cardinal Walter Casper. As you all know, he's been one of the greatest collaborators with Pope Francis' approach in Amoris Laetitia. In a lecture on the gospel of the family, he expanded on his thoughts about the relationship of mercy and justice and law to particular questions, such as how the church deals with divorced and remarried people. He makes his case, I think, most rhetorically compellingly with a question. If forgiveness is possible for the murderer, he says, then is it not also possible for the adulterer, by which he means somebody who is who has had his first marriage or her first marriage divorced, has not had an annulment, and has gone on to contract a second marriage? Now that point rings true to many people's experiences and sensibilities. Murder, after all, is much worse than adultery. If a repentant murderer can go to communion, why can't someone who has repented of the harm caused by and through his disastrous or her disastrous first marriage and gone on to conduct a fruitful, life-giving second marriage? But the response from many of those opposed to this type of flexibility in the norms guiding communion is this: however horrible, the murder is a completed wrong. It is over and done with, and therefore subject to repentance. But the adultery is still ongoing, at least as long as the parties to the second marriage continue to live together as husband and wife, i.e. have sex, rather than as brother and sister. Therefore, they say, the murderer can repent of the completed crime, but the adulterer, i.e. the person in the second marriage, cannot, at least as long as he or she intends to continue having sexual relations with the spouse, the second spouse. Now, this seems like watertight logic, right? But is it? Is there a way to break out of the frame without simply appealing to pastoral considerations, but actually try to also find some deep insight in the way law operates? I think there can be. In fact, I think if we turn to the secular, actually criminal law, as a resource, as a model, we can find some conceptual help. We can find some help regarding how we should think about how do we actually count wrongful acts. We can find some help, secondly, by thinking about how to determine when a wrongful act begins and when it ends. And ultimately, I think the criminal law can help us think about how to describe wrongful acts in the church in light of Christ's mercy. So let me turn to the criminal law for a bit. If you look at the response to Casper, which draws on Familiaris Consortio, it seems as if the adultery described in the second marriage is each and every act of sexual intercourse with the second spouse. So we add up adulterous acts by counting sexual activity. Now, from a common sense and experiential perspective, this is problematic in its understanding of marriage. It seems to suggest that the whole relationship, for example, between the couple isn't erotic, isn't shaped in a nuptial way. How can the criminal law help us rethink this? Well, the first task actually facing any prosecutor is to determine what's called the unit of prosecution for the wrong committed by the defendant. And this task is not always easy. Does a thief who takes 5 bracelets off a bureau commit 5 crimes or 1 crime? Does a father who hits his child with all his force 3 times commit 1 crime or 3? The challenge in defining the crime is more difficult when what is at stake isn't merely an isolated action, but an organized pattern of behavior. For example, one might ask, is operating an illegal tavern just one offense, or do the offenses mount up with every drink poured or customer served? Well, needless to say, the courts have had to grapple with these questions, including actually in the case of marriage and family arising out of the polygamy controversy in the last century. Consider Ex parte Snow, decided by the Supreme Court in 1887. Lorenzo Snow was a polygamist living in Utah. The federal prosecutor charged him with 3 counts of unlawful cohabitation for 3 successive calendar years. But the Supreme Court held that the government could not arbitrarily define and divide a single uninterrupted 3-year unlawful cohabitation into 3 separate criminal charges for purposes of piling up punishment. The description of the crime, they said, needed to conform to the lived experiences, the lived reality of the defendant. In a second case, Ex parte Nielsen, decided 2 years later, the federal government charged Hans Nielsen with unlawful cohabitation and the second crime of adultery. Rejecting the government's way of framing Nielsen's criminal activity, the Supreme Court held that adultery was what was called a lesser included offense. It was a crime, yes, but it was included within, it was part of the bigger picture of cohabitation. The Supreme Court insisted that in looking at what's going on in terms of criminal activity, you have to get the perspective right. They recognized that the problem mainly raised by Mormon polygamy cases was not only or mainly the sex outside of the first marriage considered in the abstract. For the American legal system at the time, the fundamental problem was that Mormon men saw themselves as entering into an additional marital relationship of which the sexual acts were only a part. Now, it seems to me that this sort of recalibration of perspective could possibly assist the church in understanding how we describe the situation of divorced and civilly remarried people. From a moral perspective, the proper description of their activity is, I believe, covenantally committed cohabitation. They may not be sacramentally married, they may not be married in the eyes of the church, but in their own eyes, they have made a solemn promise that structures their second marital life. I think it is false, inaccurate, to portray a civilly divorced and remarried Catholic as engaged in multiple disconnected acts of adultery, as if they're skulking off to some no-tell motel on Tuesday afternoon to grasp a moment of irresponsible pleasure. If there is a wrong against the first marriage, it's that second life project as a whole. The sexual activity needs to be put in its perspective. In legal terms, it's a lesser included offense. A second question about where the law might help us, the secular law, is looking at the question of when a wrongful act begins and when it actually ends. If you really think about the crime of murder, the idea that it's over instantaneously is incredible. It makes no sense. The searing pain lasts as long as the lives of those who love the victim continue. The harm to the common fabric lasts as long as the victim himself or herself would have continued to live if his life had not been cut short by the criminal act. So courts have had to grapple with this phenomenon, and they distinguish between the criminal act, which is over in a finite amount of time, and its effects, which may continue indefinitely. Consider a case. This may be familiar to some of you from the draft dodger days of the 1960s. It's called Toucey versus the United States. Robert Toucey was required to register for the draft within 5 days of his 18th birthday, which occurred in 1959. Now, he never registered with a draft board at any time, despite the fact that the law required every man aged 18 to 26 to do so. So Tousi was indicted for evading the draft in '67 and subsequently convicted of the crime. He argued on appeal that the indictment was barred by the 5-year statute of limitations. In response, the U.S. government argued, well, no, that crime continued every day that you didn't register until you turned 26. The Supreme Court said, no. It sided with the defendant and reversed his conviction. The crime was completed when he didn't register within 5 days of his 18th birthday. It set out a two-pronged test to identify continuing crimes. First, courts are to look at the intention of the lawmaker. Does the legislator intend to define the wrong as continuing or not? And second, they are to look at the nature of the crime. Does it feature a harm that continues as long as, in some ways, the conduct persists? And by continue as long, they mean, can you do something about it? So that's the typical continuing offense is kidnapping, because you could let the kidnapped victim go. Bank fraud, incidentally, I mean, this is not a how-to course, is not a continuing offense. In United States de la Mata, the court held that the defendants, although they had entered into a fraudulent lease agreement, collecting payments on the lease until they were discovered and stopped by law enforcement agents, were not engaged in a continuing crime. The prosecution maintained that the defendants were engaged until they were caught. The court said no. Taken to its logical conclusion, the collections of rents on a lease obtained by fraud for a term of 99 years would toll the statute of limitations for 99 years. We think this goes too far. So how does this help us thinking about the prohibition of adultery? Jesus clearly disfavored adultery. It's clear that he rejects divorce and remarriage as contrary to the original will of God. But nothing in Jesus' words or conduct demand that the sin involved in divorce and remarriage must be conceptualized as a sin that continues indefinitely without the possibility of effective repentance as long as one's first spouse is still alive. To impose such a requirement in every case is not merciful. And mercy is the ultimate touchstone for the divine lawgiver, and actually in some ways for civil lawgivers as well. We do not need to disturb Jesus' teaching in order to refine and develop it in these ways, in ways that moral theologians and canon lawyers have always done. Thank you.